Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It is great to see you again. This time, I have both Shrikant and Peter Berkman to thank for their assistance in this class. We've made a lot of progress since the three spheres, East, West, and digital class that we taught last year, and we have much more ambitious plans, what we're trying to accomplish. Can you throw up the first slide, please, Shrikant?
Yes. Give me a second.
Great, thank you. So before we get into the meat of the presentation here, I want to make four preparatory remarks. First, why the Catholic Church? There have been some comments that this might, in fact, limit the audience for this, and I hope that's not the case. In fact, I'm hoping this broadens the audience. How might that be the case? Well, as you recall, particularly if you were involved with the last class or have followed any of the rest of the work of the Center, the Study of Digital Life, which I run with lots of help. Our view is that the West sphere is in deep trouble. And if you were to ask the question, where will leadership come from in the West sphere under digital conditions? I think probably one of the most reasonable answers to that question, maybe surprisingly, will be the Roman Catholic Church. Now, recent events, which I'll be glad to comment on to the extent that I can in Q&A, have shown us that it is unlikely to be governments. It is unlikely to be NATO. It is unlikely to be the United Nations that provides that sort of leadership. We have gotten ourselves into a real mess here in the West sphere. How are we going to get out of it? Digital retrieves the medieval is one of our mottos, Center. And as we will go through this, that means you're going to need people with real leadership capabilities in terms of the medieval sensibility, not medieval structures, but medieval sensibilities, the psychological aspects of the Middle Ages, which are scribal, as we've described them. And the Roman Catholic Church qualifies. It's also obviously quite large, it's relatively unified, and it is everywhere around the world. So that's the reason why the Catholic Church. Number two, by what authority can I comment about these things? And the answer to that question is I am not a certified expert in any of these topics. I very much welcome anyone's help today and in the ongoing process that we're going through here to help clarify, correct any mistakes that I make. But I have a fairly wide range of disciplines that I have some knowledge of. Hopefully it's not dilettantist knowledge, but we will see. Number three, what are we trying to accomplish here? Well, we're literally trying to invent a new medium. Digital has gotten confused in many respects. And so the collaborative, the ongoing, the dynamic, and the memory dimensions of digital, we're trying to incorporate in something that we're calling a scribal hyperbook. This is an idea that came to us after the last class. I'm going to need all of your help to accomplish this. Shrikant has some incredible plans. So we're in the midst of an experiment here. This is not a classroom lecture. This is not a usual sort of presentation. This is an experiment in a new form of both dialogue and knowledge acquisition. In particular, we're trying to aim this at people who are teach themselves. And so what we're aiming at with all of this is to try to allow people who are curious, who have a lot of knowledge already, but are trying to tie pieces together, encouraging them to take this material and incorporate it much more broadly. Number 4, repeating myself. Am I narrowing the audience for this? I hope not. In fact, my deficiencies in knowledge about these topics will hopefully be supplemented by many others. And so we're going to be inviting other folks to come in and give aspects of the presentation throughout, which will supplement the Q&A. And I know there's a lot of knowledgeable people who've tuned into this. This series has been spread much farther and wider than was 3 Spheres. So in terms of those who've been invited and who will continue to be invited to participate in the process, the audience is actually both larger and I believe much more knowledgeable. Next slide, please. All right. We've got 8 questions we're going to deal with here today. As Shrikant has warned you, this covers an enormously wide range of topics. I will only be able to touch upon these in my comments, but in the Q&A, please pick any of these out and drill down further. And because this is an ongoing process, we'll have a continuing opportunity to dialogue on them. First, what happened to the Roman Catholic Church in the modern world? And we count the modern world as beginning really with what we've described previously as the print environment that begins to accelerate aggressively in the European 16th century. Important to note that the rest of the world did not have the printing press at that point. So the West sphere deeply accelerated their process, which did not happen in the East sphere, an important underlying point. The Roman Catholic Church remains to this day, in spite of incredible efforts by many people to bring the church into the modern age. That has not happened. In fact, it is a medieval institution, literally with a monarch. And so the role that the Pope plays in this, current Pope Francis is one of the reasons why I think that the church might provide a leadership role. That, of course, can be overturned with succession. He is an old man and infirm. So the role of the church is going to be modified by whoever comes after Francis, because it is an institution that in fact depends greatly upon its hierarchy. Secondly, the Catholic Church was really overwhelmed by the printing press. As a book that I've recently read, so I'm learning a great deal day by day in this. To begin with, the church was very enthusiastic about the printing press, in part because it allowed them to print indulgences. So from day one, the Catholic Church thought, oh, this is wonderful. We don't have to hire scribes to sit down and handwrite these things out, the scribal communications conditions of the Middle Ages. But instead, we can run them off in very large quantities. This, of course, became a very controversial issue. What happened in the transition to the modern world, driven by the printing press, is that many alternatives to the Catholic Church arose in Europe. The Freemasons are a critical component of all of this. To this day, there are many in the church who consider the Freemasons to be their primary opponent. I think that probably is inaccurate, but nonetheless, these old rivalries have lived on, and in particular, a rather elite component of the Freemasonic movement, which is sometimes identified as the Illuminati, which is a real organization that existed in Bavaria and elsewhere in the late 18th century. but also before that, the Rosicrucians, which probably was not an organization in the same sense, but they had the approach of reforming the whole world. That reformation of the whole world began to be published in the early 17th century, and it really upset the apple cart. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation, in particular the response with the Jesuit order, was a response, but not an effective one. In fact, the Jesuits wound up being suspended for 2 generations in the midst of all of this. So the response did not turn out so well. Furthermore, the rising of the scientific approach, experimental approach, particularly as it was associated with the Royal Society of London and their various correspondents, became a massive challenge, which we have to this day. The notion that scientists replaced priests, and in an even more narrow sense, psychologists among scientists replaced priests, is a fairly straightforward statement of the fact that the church no longer had a monopoly, if you will, on information and dealing with people's lives, but an indication that they were no longer in the vanguard. The result of this, of course, was the rising of republics, which did not exist in the current sense, along with their constitutions, including the United States and many others. Before the Treaty of Westphalia is normally where this is clocked at. That was 1648. So as you can see here, we're dealing with a period in the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, in which the church is in fairly significant combat and ultimately, I think it's fair to say, decline. Next slide, please. Let me be specific here. This confrontation between the church and the forces of modernity was very widespread, particularly in the places where the Catholic Church would have wanted to be the strongest. France, of course, we could talk all day about the anti-clerical and anti-church dimensions of the French Revolution. The placing of a prostitute, as the story goes, on the altar at Notre Dame, dubbing her Sophia, the Queen of Knowledge, is obviously a very small anecdotal part of this. And that did not end with the end of the revolution with Thermidor and so forth. In fact, Napoleon, in many ways, even strengthened this further. So those of you who know about Napoleon, know about his background, know that he was unlikely to allow any other power in his regime. And the church was the principal rival, and he effectively eliminated, went further, in fact, in the revolution, in limiting the effect of the Catholic Church, specifically in terms of education inside France. This has gotten to the point where today, the French Constitution enshrines the term laïcité in the first article of the current Constitution. So for those of you who have followed modern French history, you might have noticed that the Constitution had to be suspended. French Constitution had to be suspended in order for the French security services to try to deal with Islamic influence, because the Constitution refused to admit there was such a thing as religion. France remains a very significant issue as a result. Germany was in many ways even worse. The German relationship to the Catholic Church, including collecting taxes and paying for Catholic education, was deeply resented and undermined, and we got our term, English term, of culture war from the Germans. Kulturkampf was an extensive process of removing the church from any serious responsibilities in politics, in education. And that, of course, continues today in much of Germany. In fact, the German Catholic Church today is probably the best candidate for a group that might decide to leave the Catholic Church. So while the Catholic Church is relatively unified in the 21st century, the Germans are off on the corner of this and have actually been in many ways since Kulturkampf. If that wasn't bad enough, in Italy, in order to make a group of ununified kingdoms into what became the Italian Republic, the entire center swath of Italy were called the Papal States. They had to be seized. And so the Catholic Church ceased to be a large state and landowner, and 1870 is the year in which this particularly was concluded. The result of which is that the relationship between the Vatican and the Italian state was, for many generations, a very hostile one. In fact, the Pope, through much of this time, specifically instructed Catholics, and as you can imagine, that meant a significant part of the population, to not participate in the Republican government. So we have here in France, Germany, and Italy, a really fundamental hostility between the secular Republican leadership and the Catholic Church. They were really tossed to the curb. But I would say the reaction in Britain, and in fact, the growth of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, may have been the single most important challenge to the church. Many here, I'm sure, are quite anxious to illustrate that the backwardness of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages is certainly something we don't want to return to. And in fact, it would be impossible to do that. And that the benefits that the world has accrued as a result of industrialization, science and technology, engineering, and beyond have been so substantial in people's lives, extending lifetimes, making us far more comfortable, as Marshall McLuhan would have described it. Today, in his language, we have what he called software communism, which is to say that the average person, including those who might be considered the least fortunate, the poorest, have access to more services than any king in the Middle Ages. And these results led to a situation in the 19th century where the church really had little choice other than circling the wagons. And so in this regard, the history of Vatican I, which happens in the 1860s and effectively culminated with the seizure of the Papal States, and in particular, the assertion of papal infallibility, clearly illustrated that the church's response to this series of actions was much more of a circle the wagons sort of response than a deep understanding of what had happened. Next slide, please. What came into this vacuum? If the church had been largely excluded from the role that they had played over the course of centuries, we wound up with a series of new suggestions, alternatives, if you will, to the Catholic Church. Indeed, alternatives to even the Reformation and the Protestant churches. Friedrich Nietzsche was the son and grandson of a Lutheran pastor. He began his education with every intent of becoming, like his lineage, yet another Lutheran pastor. That did not survive his undergraduate years. And what replaced that was, in fact, a retrieval of something much older. This topic of retrieval, as you will recall, is quite important to the way we approach things. And in particular, Nietzsche is responsible for an early version of a retrieval of mythology. If there's going to be something which replaces the authority of the Catholic Church, it's not surprising that many said it should be even older than. And so there's many impulses all the way through to today to try to find the oldest possible material that you can base a broader view upon. Mythology was the context of what we have called the oral sensibility. That's to say, the sensibility that preceded the scribal, as we've laid out these distinctions. And Nietzsche, particularly in his interest with what today would be called the pre-Socratics, but also in terms of his specific professional association with the topic of philology. Philology in Germany at the time of Nietzsche, which is to say the mid to late 19th century, had already been shot through with this question of mythology. And there's an author by the name of Kreutzer, who may be familiar to those of you who have studied this time period, who became enormously important, not just for Nietzsche, but for many others. And as a result of this, we wind up with a throwback, replacing Christianity, which led in the very last lecture that Max Weber being, of course, one of the founders of modern sociology, he was really fascinated with the history of religion. So if you look at the work of Max Weber, you will find relatively easily dismissed, but nonetheless, with today's scholarship, but nonetheless, you'll find enormously lengthy descriptions of every one of the world's religions and how they fit everything together. This was a significant part. So sociology, from its earliest days, was designed to study something social that predated Christianity, much as Nietzsche's mythology was. The psyche, which is a Greek word for what we today would probably call the soul, wound up being replaced beginning in the late 19th century, but in an even more emphatic sense in the early 20th century, by what we would probably call behaviorism. Today's dominant approach to psychology, which is to say what should be the study of the soul, is called cognitive psychology. It patterns humanity on computers, which is clearly not the case, and yet it is still dominant within today's psychology. That process began in the late 19th century and accelerated, and has only gotten worse from then to now. You might judge, along with many other people, that it has failed, but nonetheless, there was no room for, in particular, the Christian God in any of this work. Furthermore, in the late 19th century, beginning in Chicago and actually continuing to this day, they still have meetings. Something called the World Parliament of Religions was convened. And interestingly, in that process, the effort to try to find a comprehensive religion that might replace everything that had come before was a fairly significant priority. It's also clearly the case that Hinduism became much more widely understood in the West as a result of these events in Chicago. By the way, that religion is Baha'i. And in the process of promoting Baha'i, which had existed long before the World Parliament, but got a huge boost, is the reason why there is a significant Baha'i temple in Evanston, Illinois. just upriver or up the lake, actually, from Chicago, where the Parliament happened. In addition to that, the proposal was that a new language should be invented. So Esperanto, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, was deliberately linked to the Baha'i religion to be a universal religion to replace every other religion. Lastly, in terms of this was God dead? The East, of course, had been rediscovered by European imperialists. There are many ways that we might describe them. Colonialists. We can probably continue to shave the language here. But the net of it was that you had a lot of particularly Brits who had become a part of the expansion of the British Empire, which was the most extensive effort. Bill, the answer to your question is no, the United Nations did not exist. Esperanto was a 19th century, not a 20th century phenomenon. And as the East was rediscovered, you began to wind up, and Max Weber was a part of this, his disenchantment of the world was accompanied with this discussion. So all of a sudden, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all flooded particularly into the Anglophonic world. There are also French, German, and other components of this. But in the English-speaking world, there was no need, in many people's view, for a Christian God anymore, because we had something older, we had something far more significant, and the net of all of this, from the standpoint of Christianity and specifically the Catholic Church, was a broad, sweeping rejection of the need for any of those beliefs and the virtues that accompanied them. Next slide, please. Why was social justice the church's response? Now, I'm sure many here will be surprised to hear that the Catholic Church invented the term social justice. And in fact, my answer to the question is charity. As it turns out, and I can post, Shrikant will figure out where to do this, but I'm going to recommend that people read a passage from 1 Corinthians, a letter written by St. Paul to the Christians in Corinth, which is in Greece. And it's significant promotion of caritas. Caritas is the Latin term for charity. So there's a natural transition, I would argue, between the church's suggestion of charity as well as its commitment to peace, that when you wind up with the kind of conflicts that were arising in the 19th century, social justice would have been the natural response to what became an increasingly heated confrontation. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, had two authors. Karl Marx would, of course, be the obvious one. Friedrich Engels may be treated, I think incorrectly, as a forethought, but it is my view, after studying this for many years, that Engels in many ways was more important than Marx. Engels had grown up in a town in Germany known as Barmen, and Barmen was considered by many, maybe still is today, the belt buckle of the fundamentalist component in German Christianity. Yes, Shrikant is reminding me that we will be adding a bibliography. We'll be referencing all of these things in the interest of continuing dynamically this conversation. Now, obviously, with lectures of this sort coming once a week, it is more than a fire hose. It's probably Niagara Falls. So we'll see how well people are able to keep up with all of this. But in addition to this, the rise of social science and social engineering presented a very significant challenge to the church. And so its assertion of social justice which is the underpinning of Catholic social teaching. And the fact that the church had to step forward, fortunately for many, and not just simply withdraw, is a feature of this conflict that is at the heart of what we're calling digital Catholic social teaching. And in order to do this, the church relied upon centuries, if not millennia, of a natural law tradition. And the best exponent of that tradition was judged to be St. Thomas Aquinas, which is the reason why he was so significant in this response. And social justice wound up resting substantially upon the work of Aquinas. So to understand why the church brought social justice to the fore, it turns out that understanding Aquinas, which is very hard to do without, in fact, committing a fair amount of time to studying Aquinas, became central. I want to here introduce a topic which we'll return to later on in the series, which is the diplomatic role played by the church, which is one of the obvious expressions of social justice. And in particular, I want to thank Victor Gaiten, who has joined us here today. He is the author of an excellent book. Anybody here who is interested, I highly recommend that you buy a copy. It's called God's Diplomats. We'll later on in the series, as I say, look at this far more closely. But the fact of the matter is, particularly in that time period, after 1870, when the church no longer had its own state to defend, it no longer had its own army, it still wound up representing and being recognized throughout this time period to this day as a recognized, authorized element of diplomacy. And the Secretary of State of the Vatican winds up being an enormously powerful influence. I'll just simply note here, you may have seen the news item that a couple of days ago, Pope Francis visited the Russian embassy in Rome and was there for an hour in conversation. That is the first time that has ever happened. That's to say with the Russians. But beneath the surface here, there's a very significant Orthodox Catholic dialogue that's been going on for quite a long time here. And the relationship in particular between the Moscow and the Kiev patricians, patriarchs, is beneath the surface and not likely to be discussed much in the headlines, at least. So from my standpoint, recognizing the conflicts that had already arisen in the 19th century, recognizing what had happened as the church had been pushed aside, recognizing as other forces had stepped into history and the potential conflicts, the role that the church began playing in the late 19th century around the topic of social justice and peace is a very natural place for the church to try to insert itself then and now. Next slide, please. As many of you may have figured out, I tend to be, when I analyze things, someone who questions the people who were involved. It's always very important to me to try to understand the biographies, the rest of the actions of those involved. And in this regard, it's impossible to ignore a very key individual in this entire history, Pope Leo XIII. Leo XIII was a long-serving pope. He served from the late 1870s until the early 20th century. His biography, very briefly here, giving you pointer to try to understand the personalities that were involved. He was initially Jesuit trained. His brother actually became a Jesuit. But importantly, he then went to probably something that's quite obscure to you. This is something that Victor Gaetan can tell us about in some great detail, the Accademia dei Nobili. This then and now is the training grounds for Vatican diplomats. So you might think Georgetown, or you might think some other foreign service academy. This was much more intense. This was very carefully hand-selected. And all of this was obviously under the broader principles of the church, making it quite different and making that core of people quite unique in terms of the overall world situation then and now. He was quite open about the topic of church history. And in fact, in addition to commissioning a massive edition of Thomas Aquinas, he's the one who brought Aquinas back into the center of the question. He also funded a very significant effort to research church history. So Ludwig Pastor, a German researcher, I think ultimately produced roughly 20 volumes. They're quite fascinating, out of date, probably in many ways with modern scholarship, but nonetheless, the impulse to not try to hide what went on, but rather to in fact concentrate on it was one of Leo XIII's most important initiatives. Also, the relationship between the church and science. The Vatican Observatory had been shut down. The observatory, you might think Galileo, you might think a number of other connections here. He refounded that. And it is, to this date, it's a very interesting place. I've met the man who currently runs the Vatican Observatory, kind of a Carl Sagan-like figure in my regard, but nonetheless, this continues to be an important part of the Vatican's activities. As you might expect of a diplomat, which is his background, he strengthened ties with many states. Here we're talking about effectively all of the major states around the world in the late 19th century. And he published very extensively. 46 encyclicals and apostolic letters, which may correspond to the fact that he had such a long period as Pope, but nonetheless, many of these were really quite groundbreaking. So much of what I talk about tends to leave the individuals involved out of the conversation. So I thought I would throw in a slide here in case anyone is interested, in fact, in one of the very key individuals associated with all of this. Next slide, please. So, as you know, our approach to these topics derived largely from the research work of Marshall McLuhan is try to understand history from a standpoint of the dominant communications paradigms of the time. Our view, which we have detailed in earlier lectures and will return to throughout, is that the oral world transitioned into a scribal world. We believe that, in fact, electricity retrieved much of the orality, whereas we think that the current digital environment will be retrieving the scribal world. But this shift from, if you will, figurative art to abstract art, along with a shift from the linearity of the printing press to a more acoustic surround, remembering here that things like Cubism, and for that matter, Freudian psychology, attempted to dissect people. And so what happened is the insides became evident, and this was a massive change. McLuhan would suggest to us that the artists are the antenna of the race, implying to us if we would like to understand what the new sensibility is, we should look to art. He was an English professor, so it's quite natural that that would be his orientation, but it's a very powerful one. But it's not the only one. What happened, as many of us know, in the early 20th century, is that everybody came up with a system for how to organize the world. You could argue that the system associated with distributism, which I won't go into in any great detail here, but will in a later session, was a system based upon Catholic social teaching. Obviously, fascism, communism, many other isms. In fact, an old friend of mine, Manuel de Landa, Mexican, baptized Catholic, but very much estranged from the Catholic Church, once put together a film called Ism. It was a kind of a satire on the whole process, but the early 20th century is filled with isms. I'm now using the word systems as a substitute for the topic of isms. Technocracy, on and on and on. These systems were attempts to deliberately organize something that had replaced what the Catholic Church had called natural law. And for those of you who were with us in the previous series, you will have noted that I suggested that for the West to recover and take its role in a three spheres world, which is what digital has given us, natural law will have to return. And in the process of doing that, the whole topic of systems, and indeed the underlying engineering notion associated with systems, will have to be very deeply analyzed. Academia, as many of you might know, the history of academia, Peter asked this question actually in earlier dialogue, wasn't the topic of specialization in academia really a product of the print era? I'm sure there was a good deal of that, but it didn't in any way become as severe as it did under the electric conditions of the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, Harvard University continued to include the topic of psychology in their philosophy department until the 1930s. So for those of you who are familiar, one reference here will be the importation of German organization. Many people here know that the PhD was not a Anglophonic. It is not something that was invented at Oxford or Cambridge. It was invented, or Harvard or Yale for that matter. It was invented in Germany. And so there's a fascinating account of this called the Leipzig Connection. Many of the senior elites in the United States, I'm thinking here in particular of J. Pierpont Morgan, but many others, they finished their education by going to Germany. And a lot of that got brought back. We wound up with Cornell, we wound up with Johns Hopkins, we wound up with a number of new universities devoted very much to these specializations. I guess I should confess that I attempted twice to get a specialized degree. First of all, Doctor of Divinity at the University of Chicago, and then second of all, a PhD in molecular biology at the University of Wisconsin. I failed both times. So back to my introductory remark, it may be the reason why I'm giving these lectures is just because I refused to be specialized or failed maybe at being specialized. But that was one of the more important intellectual effects of electricity. Propaganda took over with mass media. Today, we have a great number of people who describe what is going on Facebook and elsewhere, the mis, mal, and disinformation world in which we now live, cartoons appearing in Facebook with the four horsemen of the apocalypse being joined by a fifth with the title Misinformation. This is inaccurate in many ways and not particularly well informed, but the psychology involved, and yet there's some important connections here. So we wind up with a situation in which there would apparently be no room for something like the Catholic Church and its doctrines. But Peter added this last bullet here, which is very important for us to recall. Magic, which was very much the world of the oral sensibility, came back in a significant way, accompanying mythology. And the specific place that this is expressed is in advertising. Mass media advertising is entirely an expression of ritual magic. Now, in this regard, and when I put together the bibliography for all of this, I'll be making a recommendation that you take a look at a book, actually a modern illustrated novel, or maybe adult comic book, done by an associate of ours, Senator Douglas Rushkoff, and it's entitled Alistair and Adolf, Alistair Crowley and Adolf Hitler, and how the two of them deliberately used magic in terms of their broader social impact. Well, advertising is at the heart of the problem we're now having with media like Facebook and so forth. And this is going to have to be much more seriously considered as we go forward. Business models are likely going to have to change. Next slide, please. I see I'm kind of running long on my time here in terms of taking 45 minutes. I'm about 45 minutes into this presentation, so I'll go quickly here.
That's all right, Mark. Mark, this is going very well, so please take your time. We'll make sure that people get full 45 minutes of Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So what did the church do? It would appear, based on the context that I've laid out here, that the church would be, their hair would be on fire. That basically everything the church stood for had been flushed. This is, in many regards, in fact, what happened. The church wound up withdrawing from an enormous amount of public exchange. The successor to Leo XIII, who probably is just as important as an individual in understanding the trajectory here, was Pius X. His insistence in, I think, 1910, that every priest, everyone who taught at a seminary and beyond, had to actually sign and file an oath against modernism. So the approach the church took to this series of events I just described here was very much one of withdrawing from secular inquiries and this circling of the wagons. There really was little option under the circumstances. Electricity had dramatically emphasized the worst aspects, if you will, of the print environment, which had been the initial assault against the scribal medieval church. And in this inwardness, there was a very significant promotion of mystical experiences. I'm not here in any way dismissing these experiences. I'm merely noting that what became more important for the church, since evangelism more broadly in the world had been cut off in so many places, was to turn inward. And one of the indications of the importance of this, and that it wasn't just simply isolated individuals, there's a category, an important one, within the church called doctors of the church. So you will notice, if you go to the Wikipedia page, or if you study this topic, that beginning in the 1920s, for a century now, virtually every doctor of the church who was added was a mystic. Whereas before that, none of them were categorized specifically as mystics. This inward turning is also associated with the philosophical turn known as phenomenology. And it may be just worth noting here that Martin Heidegger, who is often championed as the best representative of what happened with phenomenology, he began his academic career hoping to become a Jesuit theologian. I believe that Heidegger exited the church and then, in fact, became quite hostile to the church, largely a result of this withdrawal and the recognition that he would not be able to function within that situation. One of the more important highlights along the way here is a later successor of Pius X. There's another pope in between who didn't last too long, was Pius XI, another fascinating figure, and in particular, his attempt to build a Catholic international in opposition to the Communist International. This, by the way, built the structures into which Marshall McLuhan then later fit. Again, we'll have some references on that. And the ultimate culmination in many ways of this response, which remains in some quarters a difficult one today, was Vatican II and the assertion that we needed a new theology. In this process, much of what Leo XIII had done was set aside, and we're still struggling, or the church is still struggling, with the result of all of this. Last slide, please. So this, of course, is the question which we're really trying to put to ourselves. It is the primary assertion of our work that the electric modern world is now over. I opened and closed every one of the previous sessions in the Three Spheres class by simply saying we no longer live in the modern world. Another way of saying that is our use of the sense from The Wizard of Oz, here, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get power into my machine, which I forgot to do. Our sense that, in fact, the modern world has been replaced by something fundamentally different. And this is a digital world, as we would describe it. And we think the sensibility associated with the digital world, retrieving the medieval, retrieving the scribal, therefore our scribal hyperbook, implies an important shift in people's sensibilities. A shift from fantasy to memory. So here we'll refer you to the, I think, groundbreaking work that we've done on the topic of the inner senses. But probably more importantly, even than that, is that for the first time ever, humanity is now confronting an artificial version of itself. This artificial humanity forces human beings to consider what it means to be authentic. This is a challenge that's never occurred in the modern world. It's a challenge that requires us to remember what it means to be human. And in that process, we will necessarily have to invent, generate new systems sciences. We began with the topic of psychology in our own work. We're going to continue as later sessions in this series will indicate, with economics, with political science. All of these, as were generated under the electric era, are going to have to be deeply reconsidered and, I think, ultimately replaced. Furthermore, as many have noted, we are today in a crisis of meaning. That crisis of meaning, which John Vervenke, a psychologist at Toronto, has managed to give 56 lectures on, all of which are available on YouTube, That crisis of meaning is not going to be tolerated. Specifically, we are going to return to an understanding of causality. As Aristotle informed us, you cannot understand anything without understanding its causes. Causes have largely been eliminated in the 20th century. That is not tolerable. So the modern world got rid of causality. It's now in a process of returning. And lastly, we're in a situation in which you can look around and you can find assertion of virtue in many places that you look at. It's a significant part, as distorted as it is, of what's going on today in academia. What is missing, needless to say, in this virtue quest, which is underway, where even the four original main virtues, pagan virtues, as it turns out, are not that clearly described, is the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Very importantly, charity, which is the substance of this Corinthians reading that I'll be suggesting to you, are now being widely remembered, questioned, explored. I'm a part of a group in Warsaw called the Gaia Think Tank. I'm on their steering committee. The point of this organization is to try to ask the question, how can we generate, design, and build robots that have compassion? You might think that's a rather strange thing to even think about. In fact, there's an enormous effort now to come up with AI ethics. AI ethics is not the same thing as AI morality. And it certainly is not the same thing as AI compassion. And in order for us to examine this question, we first have to ask the question, why is it that humans, or in fact, are humans compassionate? This is just one of many examples of how the theological virtues are now being widely remembered. So again, thank you very much for your patience in going through all this material. I understand that what we have said today could itself have filled a seminar, a semester or maybe 2 semesters in a seminar. I apologize for the very wide-ranging character what we've talked about. I hope to get a little bit more detailed in the remaining sessions. There's 7 more Sundays leading us up to Easter Sunday in this class. Again, I want to thank Srikant and Peter Berkman in particular for their help in all of this. And now we're going to get back to Srikant. Thank you.
All right, folks. So now it's the time for Q&A. The rules for Q&A are very simple. You get 1 question, try to make it count, put your best question on the table, try to be brief. Feel free to ask as many questions. We want as many questions as possible. I'll collect all the questions and then we'll organize them and then we'll go through them one by one. All right, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat if you'd like to ask a question, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Either way works. Okay, we are going to start with Arthur followed by DLJ. Arthur, what's your question?
Yeah, it seemed like I didn't write down which number of the slide this was, but you had talked about universalism and the World Parliament of Religions and Esperanto and so on, this movement in the 19th century toward universalism. But also in the 19th century, we had the nationalist movement, right? In fact, I was reminded of this by looking at the Wikipedia page for Kreutzer, and it said, well, actually, he was all about universalism too. This came from this. But really, Wagner, et cetera, didn't really like that at all because they wanted their mythology to all be uniquely German and so on. And each country had their own little nationalist movement there. So I was curious if you had anything to say about the sort of, there's one a reaction to the other. They were sort of simultaneous. It wasn't like there was a big universalist movement in isolation in the 19th century. They were playing off each other.
That's right.
Got it. Excellent. Different universalist movements. Excellent. Next up is going to be DLJ. DLJ, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mark. That was yeah, I liked it, particularly the end bit, because that's the AI and ethics is the project I've been working on for the last 5 years. So yeah, seriously set up in attention at that point. The bit I think I missed, and maybe this was from the previous sessions, which I didn't attend, or maybe you're going to cover it later, I don't know. But why I didn't catch why the Catholic Church should be the new what? Unifying force? Is that what you're arguing for?
Very, very good. What is the role of Catholic Church in the future? Is that what you're asking?
Well,
Why?
the introduction was the world is falling apart. I'm summarizing. World is falling apart. We need a new unifying force. I didn't hear the proposition as why that should be the Catholic Church.
Got it. Got it. Very good. Next up is going to be you. You go ahead. You can ask your question. You can unmute and ask your question. Go ahead. Okay, Yu's question is the way God has been imaged in our minds changing? Go ahead, you. Go ahead.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask. Is the way God has been imaged in our minds changing? Because I understand that you've introduced the introduction of the Eastern philosophies and things like that, and I'm wondering if that's the case.
Excellent question. Thank you. Next up is Zheng, followed by Joe. Zheng.
Yeah, my question is, we all realize, without religion as one of the spiritual, for spiritual growth, is what people are missing in current world. The question is, what is the solution? I know Jordan Peterson also suggests the church, but with people grow as atheists like me from China, this is not even possible solution. So I found people usually trace back to their childhood. So for the people of the universal world, it seems they need another container, something new to be able to support that.
Wonderful.
The global.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is going to be, give me a second here. Joe, go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Mark, for a great presentation and for joining us today and for teaching this course. It's an honor to have you here. Really quickly, I guess my question is a little bit as to how the Catholic Church would actually serve as a unifying force going forward, primarily because there's been such a decline in vocations to the priesthood, and there's been a decline in their membership. So how are they going to actually come up with a strategy that they can be a unifying force?
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. These are, folks, these are excellent questions. Let's keep them coming. We'll organize all of them, and then we're going to try to answer all of them. Peter, you're next.
Hey, so my question is less on the content and more about the structure of the rest of these seminars. So as we continue, how are you going to, I guess, how are all of us going to together discuss Catholic social teaching in this context? And sort of, could you give a brief explanation of what that is? What is Catholic social teaching, and what is digital Catholic social teaching? I think that would be helpful to clarify this big.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. All right, folks, we got some amazing questions here. So let's see here. So first I want to look at, we'll start with
Laura's raising her hand. I don't know if you want to
Laura, I don't see you. Go ahead, Laura. Laura, what's your question?
Okay, well, my question is, I'm an average parent and my kid goes to school, and there are lots of other people like me who are unsatisfied with situations. And you're out there telling me that there's a way to do this. But I haven't heard that they're associated to the Catholic Church. And I know very many of the people that in this, let's say my liberal school, are not very religious or not, and would not want to hear that's associated with the Catholic Church. And many other people wouldn't like it. It's the way that you can introduce all this, create all this, that people don't really know that anything to do with the Catholic Church. And they just love what you're talking about. Can you present this in a way that people will love it, not know any of this history, nothing. You've got, slam dunk kind of thing. How do you do it?
Excellent, excellent question. Thank you, Laura. Excellent. All right, so Mark, we've got some really amazing questions. So first, I mean, it looks like I'm going to start by, we always go kind of broadest questions first. So we're saying that there is a problem. Many people have said clearly there is a problem. And one of the problems, I think Jean put it, that there isn't spirit, spirituality is lost and it needs to be recovered. So firstly, that's the problem. And what in principle are solutions to it? And where does Catholic Church fit in providing a solution to this problem? So let's look at the problem itself first. So how do you solve the problem of loss of spirituality in the modern world?
Well, the answer is obviously individuals are going to have to recognize this crisis and examine their own consciences as a result of this. Debbie and I, Debbie Newman on the screen here, my girlfriend, longtime girlfriend, we went yesterday to Harlem. We often do this on Saturdays where we say, let's go on an adventure. And often we'll drive for an hour outside of the city and find a place and go have lunch. Well, we decided we were going to go to Harlem and have brunch. The first place we tried to go to, where I've eaten actually before, called the Red Rooster, wound up with no reservations available. We're all sold out. Don't even bother. The second place we went to was called the Angel of Harlem. And I'm emphasizing this in part because the name Angel of Harlem would indicate that there's some religious component to this. Much to our surprise, I'm sure that people know a lot more about this than I do. We wound up in a hip hop rave. We wound up in a situation in which both Debbie and I had to put earplugs in. And because of the lyrics, which made their way through the earplugs, I was very tempted to ask the waiter if we could have a side dish of motherfucker. Because that was, as you know, a very constant refrain. And this was not subtle. This was turned up so loud, and everybody was sitting in their seats, bopping away to all of this. Yes, as Debbie says, including some very large people, but dressed to the nines. And so I've been scratching my head since then. And it occurred to me this morning, actually, when I was at church, that what we witnessed yesterday is the current status of the Black church. As it turns out, at the corner of 122nd Street what is it? Not Martin Luther King, it was Frederick Douglass Boulevard, 122nd, is where Angel of Harlem is located. And we parked our car on 122nd, and right across from us was this massive, I presume, Baptist church. Nobody going in, nobody coming out. So the recognition that the absence of spirituality in our lives, and more importantly, the absence of Christian religion in many of our lives, is a causal component and a critical causal component to the breakdown that we're all experiencing. It will be individuals who will sort that out. I'm not here in the role of an evangelist. I'm not here trying to convince you to believe this, that, or the other thing, or to join a particular church. But what I am suggesting is that all of us are inevitably, I believe, particularly as driven by the artificiality of AI and algorithms, we will be compelled to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? And we'll be compelled to ask the question, what has caused us to get into a situation like the one in which we're now in? And I'm quite confident that many people will answer that question with secularity is the cause of this underlying problem. Not everybody, to be sure, but more and more. And I think this is already underway, as best I can tell. We're in the early stages of this. I turned 74 a couple weeks ago. I doubt that I will live to see this all play out. Our children are the ones who are going to decide all of this. So Laura's question about her school and the liberality associated with it and how the kids are going to react to this, the answer is the kids are going to decide how this all turns out. And I strongly suspect that they will begin to understand the relationships and the causal factors involved. Could be wrong, and we're in for big trouble if I am.
All right, so there are three categories of questions left. Okay, first category is about the conception. So is the image of God changing? Are there multiple universalist mythologies that people have used? So that's one category of questions, which is relatively small. There's a number of questions about the Catholic Church. And lastly, there is Peter's question about how we are planning to deal with the Catholic social teaching and specifically digital Catholic social teaching. So those are the three categories. So I would suggest we spend a little bit of time on the first category, spend a lot of time in the second category about Catholic Church, because there are lots of questions on it, and then do give a heads up about how we are planning. Does that make sense to you?
Sure.
Okay, so how is the image of God changing? What are the different ways in which, we talked about Jung providing a mythology, Nietzsche and the mythology,
Right.
were there different variations of it? How has image of God changed in modern times?
We're exiting one psychological, intellectual, social regime, which we've described as electric. We're entering another regime, environment, paradigm, which we've described as digital. The fundamental answer to all of these questions is, how do human beings deal with that transition? It is impossible for them to continue answering these questions in the same way. The collection of liberal answers and secular answers, in my view, simply cannot sustain themselves. They have proven over and over again to be failures. The headlines should convince us more and more, week by week, month by month, that's the case. So we're going to wind up searching for alternatives. What I've suggested is that under electric conditions, many alternative images of God, and the important term there is image, have been proposed. My guess is that we're going to move away from images, frankly. My guess is that images are a significant part of the problem, and that people's image of God is not going to solve anybody's problems. So, to the question put, I'm looking, by Zheng. Many Chinese have in fact already opted for Christianity. The relationship between the Vatican and the CPC has gotten a lot of attention on all of this. And so I'm agreeing, however, that in general, China will not adopt Christianity as its answer to this question. And yet within the East sphere, so it is important here to recall, and back to the point raised by DLJ about what may have been missed by not attending, we're no longer in a unified world. In fact, our three spheres presentation suggests that the East, the West, and a new sphere called the digital sphere are likely to go in very different directions. That fragmentation and the crisis as it is expressed in each of those respective spheres will come up with different answers. So I'm not here telling you that there will be universally for all of humanity one answer to these questions, but I am telling you that there will be across the board, without any doubt, a much more robust effort to move past the topic of images to actual understanding. And that understanding will require remembering. And so this shift from images, which are largely fantasy, to a much more memorative, much more historical, much more specific to our own spheres set of answers seems to me already to be very much underway. So it is important for me to note here that the work we do at the center, to the extent we can, does not profess to be prophetic. We're not trying to tell you what is going to happen 10 years from now. We're trying to describe what is already underway. And so our observations is that the world is already significantly moved in this direction. And we could discuss at some length the evidence for and against that happening. But my answer to the question here is that the image of God is going to be replaced, is already being replaced by faith. Faith is not a matter of images. Faith is not a matter of a psychological sleight of hand. And so the theological virtue of faith, however that may be expressed in these respective spheres, must and is already being reasserted. That's one of the reasons why we're doing these series.
Wonderful. So let's do one thing. Let's take, there are some new questions that have come in. Let's take those questions and incorporate them. So Bill, Mark, and Jacqueline, go ahead and ask your question in audio. Bill, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? I just
Yes.
Okay, so here's this. Thank you, Mark. This is fascinating. Even though we've been discussing this for hours, it really helps to see it laid out in linear fashion. How many people inside the leadership of the Catholic Church believe it's their job to lead us into the digital promised land here in this life, as opposed to leading us into, the eternal kingdom of angels?
Wonderful. Excellent. Next question is by Mark Klugman. Mark, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Mark. You made a passing reference, Mark, to the case of Germany and the potential separation from the church. You're aware, of course, your reference to Francis was interesting because there's a strong rejectionist element against Francis. So I wanted to ask you, to what degree does your thesis make a presumption about the church holding together as opposed to suffering a significant schism?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Next up is Jacqueline. Jacqueline, go ahead. Jacqueline, are you there? Jacqueline, go ahead. You are unmuted. Okay, there is looks like there is an audio problem. Go ahead and type your question. I will incorporate it then. Excellent. All right, so now we are going to go to the set of questions about the Catholic Church. So first question, and you can take it in any order. Let me list all the questions. So one of the questions was, yes, there is a problem. Why is Catholic Church the solution? Number two, how is it that Catholic Church will actually serve in this role, given all the, given its current state? Number three, do the people in the Catholic Church, are they committed to doing this? Number four, will the church split up in this process of doing that? And the last one is that there are people who are kind of buy the entire argument, but don't want it to come through the Catholic Church. Is it possible to have it separately. So those were all the questions. So I would say we can start with the first one. You can go through as many. If you miss anything, I'll bring that up.
Sure. Well, let me actually start with the last one. And it leads into many of the others. I understand the effectiveness of the electric media environment, and in particular television, in denigrating the Catholic Church. I understand that. I understand that in many respects, the Catholic Church today is just completely gone in terms of consideration. There's no possibility. I understand that. And that may turn out to be true. However, it is an electric attitude quite deliberately brought to us by a paradigm that has itself now collapsed. So the question, like all the other questions, need to be posed to the extent we can from the standpoint of underlying assumptions that we're being presented in the media, and many of which we may have personal knowledge about, including abuse by priests and so forth. The question is whether those premises will continue, whether they will hold. It happens, I believe, to be the case that premises on important matters like this change dramatically under new paradigm conditions. So the difficulty throughout this series, I'm sure, and we experienced this the last time around. Last time around, I said globalism is gone. What's happening in Ukraine right now is an illustration of how globalism is gone. If globalism worked, there would have been no invasion of Ukraine. If globalism worked, then the effort to bring Russia into that globalist fold would have been pursued instead of what we've actually experienced here. So, well, there are many other straightforward things to say, including charitable things to say about current events. They illustrate to me that the old paradigm has actually collapsed in a very dangerous way. We've got nuclear forces now on high alert on both sides of this conflict. This is not a success, this is a failure. And so the answer to this question is the view that we have today of the Catholic Church, I suspect will be very different 10 years from now. Could be wrong. But to continue here, does today's Catholic leadership believe that they need to take this leadership role? So to be clear here, for those in particular who missed the earlier series, we're dealing with the Western sphere. The Western sphere, out of the three that we've described, East, West, and digital, is the least confident of itself, has a population of people who are the least sure if they're on the right track, is the sphere that is the most concerned with the crisis in which we're now in, and is the most likely to continue to fail, as events in Ukraine, I think, would illustrate. We're in failure mode here. Can that be sustained? Can this failure keep on going on? Can we wind up with China taking an even more dominant role? Can we wind up with the digital sphere, those who want to replace humans with machines? Can we wind up with them taking a more prominent role? Yes, of course. The West doesn't have to persist forever. But I think what's happened here, particularly under Francis's papacy. Now, it was noted, I think by Arthur, that basically nobody likes Francis. And something like that seems to have occurred. So what happened under his predecessor, Benedict the 16th, or probably unfairly, we call him B16, it was an attempt to take politics, left-right politics in particular, out of church discussions. That failed. Obviously, people want to stake out their territory. What Victor Gaitan has written about, and we'll hear more about later in terms of the behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts, get nobody's attention as people push their own agendas. So I think the fair answer now is that the church is divided, at least superficially. Will that, and Francis is a figure, as was Benedict before him, who was greatly concerned about that, and as a result, Benedict wound up being more championed, I guess, by conservatives, and it may be that Francis is more championed by liberals, but I think that probably is not even the case. The momentum of people wanting to continue to express their political views continues to dominate. So it might very well be that the church cannot overcome this. It may well be that the electric media environment, which drove those differences, you would not have found those differences in the same form under print or earlier scribal conditions. Electricity greatly exacerbated those questions. It was then, I guess, Arthur who said, well, schism on the way. Did I get that right? No, I missed it again. All right, well.
That's all right. It's on Mark, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is that's highly unlikely. My view is that the superficial differences that are then amplified by electric media are not what's going to determine the situation. The shift in the underlying paradigm and the alignment between that paradigm shift and what the church has to offer is what I'm suggesting. So I'm not suggesting that everybody's going to become a Catholic. It clearly is not the case. What I am suggesting is that leadership in the West is now recognized very broadly to be deeply needed. I asked myself then the question, what institutions in the West have a chance of providing at least a component of that leadership? And what I come up with is the Roman Catholic Church as the most likely institution to make a transition from an electric to a digital paradigm, and in the process, provide leadership much more broadly than simply for the church. Remember that the largest impact of Vatican II, probably, broadly speaking, was its description as an ecumenical council. Now, many would say that was the church trying to reconcile itself with the modern world. That would not be the way I describe it. To the extent there was a spirit of Vatican II that I think will be sustained through these changes, it was in fact the recognition that Islam, the recognition that Orthodox Christianity, the recognition that Protestant Christianity, the recognition that Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, these are not going to be converted. These are going to be brought together in ecumenical discussions. This is, again, the role that the church has played in terms of moral leadership, which will be enormously important as we go forward. Leadership here doesn't mean political leadership. It doesn't mean economic leadership. It means moral leadership. That's what will be needed in this new paradigm. And I don't think there's anybody of importance, at least, in today's Catholic Church, who doesn't recognize that must involve many different approaches to this topic. Francis has promoted the notion of polyhedral globalism. The image that I think he has used and that I have is of a soccer ball. So if you take a look at the soccer ball, you'll see that it's actually these interlocking shapes that are all sewn together. So they make up a globe, but yet they're distinct from each other. This sensibility is mandatory, I believe, for moral leadership going forward. What did I miss, Srikant?
I want to ask a question in a couple of ways, just to reiterate this point. Why do you think that the Catholic Church is uniquely situated to provide a solution? And how will it do it? How do you see it doing it?
I see it doing it by asserting in an ecumenical fashion a moral leadership for peace. I see it asserting this leadership in favor of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. I see it doing this through the fact that there are 1.3 billion Catholics in the world, everywhere. I see it doing this through, if you will, its connection, as it considers itself, its connection to divine grace. I see it doing this because of its longevity. It is the oldest standing institution in the Western sphere. I see it doing this through its resources. I see it doing this based upon its own stated objective. And I see it doing this because I cannot find an alternative. The Queen of England is going to die any day now. The English monarchy is not going to accomplish the goals that we're talking about. Whatever happens in terms of the conflict between Russia and NATO, it's not with Ukraine, it's obviously it's conflict with NATO. Whatever happens with that, Russia's not going to be the institution that accomplishes this. NATO's not the institution that's going to accomplish this. The Chamber of Commerce isn't going to do this. Make a list of institutions. The United States Constitution is not going to do this. So as you make that list of institutions that will play a leading moral role in the digital paradigm, I have no doubt that the opportunity, not necessarily the conclusion. So remember, I'm not here predicting. I'm not here prophesying. I'm trying to describe what has already happened. It has already occurred that the Roman Catholic Church has played a significant moral leadership role around the world already. They're already doing this. The means of doing this are generally hidden from the public. So you will not see the so-called mainstream media reporting this. This is why Victor's book is so important in the face of all of this. You will see reports of various elements, and to be sure, today it's very scattered. It might well be the entire thing dissolves, particularly when Francis is replaced. What I will tell you is that this series of seminars, which will culminate on Easter Sunday, we'll be done with this before some of us actually go to Rome to poke the hornet's nest. In May, we're going to Rome at the invitation of the Lateran University and Notre Dame to present some of this material. We may find out in that process that nobody likes what we're doing. We may find out that it has remarkable legs. And so stay tuned. This process of dealing with digital Catholic social teaching is not confined to this 8-week course. It's not confined to the Scribal Hyperbook that we hope to produce coming out of all of this. It is an ongoing process. I hope we have a chance to continue dialoguing about it.
Wonderful. So, folks, I want to say a couple of things. The topic that Mark is dealing with is a humongous topic. It is about a moral crisis, a spiritual crisis. So first part of it is that you have to understand the scope of the problem itself. And in principle, what the solutions are. So the kinds of things that he will be talking about will be the kinds of solutions that are needed. And actually the East Sphere will need another version of it themselves. What will happen is that I love all the questions, and these are all legitimate questions. And the way we have structured this series, so we can engage with people, okay? So we could not get to many questions today. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to post all the questions that have been already put down. I'm going to post them on the page. The URL I'm putting in here is the web page for this particular session. The video of this will appear there. All the slides will appear there. All the questions that have been asked, not answered, will appear there. Peter has been keeping notes. He's the resident scribe here. He's keeping notes of all the lecture notes of Peter are going to appear there. There is a place for commenting there. Go ahead and put the comments. Go ahead and put what you see as the problems. Go ahead and put your additional questions. We are actively looking at it. We are going to make those questions flow back into the spoken. So the idea of the scribal hyperbook is this flow between written and oral. At our meetups, we do a spectacular job of going from written to oral. With the scribal hyperbook, we're trying to complete the loop. Partly thanks to the great work that Peter is doing, because you will be able to see this lecture in written format. So you can engage with it with your, you can take notes, you can ask questions, and we are going to keep feeding this back into the meetups. So really looking forward to all your questions. Go ahead. I know Laura has questions. Robert has questions. So please go ahead and put the questions now on the web page that I've given. I'll put the video there as well. Peter's notes are there as well. And let's build this. This is a dialogue. This is not one-way communication. This is a dialogue. So really appreciate the questions, and we will go ahead. Let's see, Jacqueline had a question. So let's take one last question. Is it okay, Mark? Can we take one last question from Jacqueline?
Yeah, and then I want to wrap up answering Peter's question by choosing the rest of the series.
Sure. Okay. Give me a second. So, Peter, can you go ahead and read out Jacqueline's question?
Sure. Yeah, it says, Jacqueline writes, I spent the last 2 years studying art in Belgium, and the basis of my final project was my Christian experience in the USA growing up. My professors were far less receptive to the influences and enthusiastic about the religious premise. My work was much more well received by peers my age, 18 to 25, partially, I think, because of the, quote, loss of spirituality and culture due to tech, but these are also young people more strongly drawn towards other mythological influences like astrology, because it seems more welcoming and less intimidating. How is it that the church can combat the negative reputation it has, at least in Europe, particularly amongst youth, in the face of mythology that seems much more appealing to young people right now?
A quick answer to your question, Jacqueline, is we completely agree that it will be today's 20-somethings, particularly smart 20-somethings, who are going to make the difference. So obviously, at my age, and probably many of the rest of us, we're going to expire before all these events work their way through. But I think what you just described is what we've been highlighting as the conflict between the old paradigm, which is based on mythology, and the new paradigm, which is based on remembering what it means to be moral. So it should not be at all surprising that we wind up with this confusion today. And it will persist. But the direct answer to your question is that the church will deal with the negative views presented, particularly by electric media, by ignoring those negative views, by simply being the church. This is no longer a debate. The abuse scandal is no longer an issue. It should be on people's concerns. And we will see how the smart 20-somethings sort their way through that. There will be a battle. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak in the future tense. There is already a massive battle, which you just expressed in terms of those people your age. It is colossal and relentless. And the generations which are coming behind the smart 20-somethings may ultimately be the ones who have to resolve this, because they'll be born into and operating in a world. So my guess is that infants born today are going to wind up with a radically different view of the world than 20-somethings today. And so we'll have to see how that turns out.
Wonderful. So now Peter's question. Peter, would you like to ask it again one more time?
Sure. My question was simply, how is the rest of this course going to be structured? And my way of asking that is, what is Catholic social teaching, and what do you mean by digital Catholic social teaching?
Sure. So I apologize. I've been taught to tell people what you're going to say, then tell them again, then tell them a third time. And so Peter's exactly correct. I probably should have started out this presentation with an overview of where we're heading. So let me finish this presentation that way, and we'll get into this much more deeply next week. It turns out, and next week is another backgrounder, if you will. So I've fallen into perhaps the error of providing too much context before I get to the meat and potatoes, so to speak. The direct answer to Peter's question is Catholic social teaching will be the topic of next week's session. It revolves around 3 encyclicals, 1891, 1931, and 1991. Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years, and Centesimus Anno, 100 years. 3 respective popes over the course of a century have laid down the basic components, which rest on 3 pillars, each of which will be the topic of 2 lectures as we complete the sequence of 8. The first of those is human dignity. And human dignity means something radically different before you start producing artificial humans. So under electric conditions, print conditions, Scrabble conditions, the question of human dignity had a variety of dimensions to it, which have now been radically transformed. Digital Catholic social teaching must deal with human dignity in a world filled with robots who are not humans, who are going to express their own dignities and their own rights. And so what it means to be human is the question that arises, and the answer around human dignity, I believe, is the most coherent answer to that question, because it requires us to remember that we have a soul, which robots cannot have. Secondly, the question of subsidiarity. That's the second pillar of Catholic social teaching. Subsidiarity meant one thing in the early 20th century under electric conditions. Distributism was the basic answer to that question. It means something radically different under digital conditions. So we are now capable of organizing society using digital technology in ways that were never possible before. Obviously, we all carry around the Library of Alexandria in our pocket, so we could self-educate. A population that is self-educated would never put up with the world in which we currently live. They throw their hands up in the air. They try to figure out some other place. The massive number of efforts by people to go off and start their own places. This is not just DAOs. This is Hawaii wanting to leave the United States. This is a whole series of efforts where people are saying, I'm just not going to put up with it anymore. I'm not going to participate anymore. I'm going to start my own new thing now. This is a very widespread view at this point. And so how we organize ourselves, and in particular, how we deal with the principle of subsidiarity, which is to say, everything should be delegated, the responsibility. It's usually expressed in terms of decision-making. So it winds up becoming this kind of who gets to vote on this and so forth. I think responsibility is far more the point here. We're going to come to a recognition that there are some things we're not responsible for and shouldn't be expected to be. As a result of that, what we now call democracy cannot be sustained. Every time you hear somebody promote democracy, you know they're talking about something that's already gone. No one believes in that anymore, other than for ideological reasons. So as we move to a situation in which digital technology allows us to reorganize society such that we can distribute responsibility where it belongs, that winds up being of radically different economics, radically different political economics. And thirdly, solidarity. How is it that all of humanity can live together in peace? And given the differences between us, which cannot be swept under the rug, given the fact that we don't all have the same cultures, given the fact that we are, in Francis' terms, living in a polyhedral global world, how do we deal with that? And that is a question that has never arisen before, other than various efforts to try to reduce to one universality or another, which is completely impossible under digital conditions. So anybody who steps forward and says they have the universal solution, my guess is that most smart people will say, no, you don't. There will be multiple solutions. And yet there is a solidarity that must underpin that. So in all of these respects, human dignity, subsidiarity, solidarity, each of which will be the topic of 2 sessions as we can round out the total of 8. They wind up being principles that have radically different expression under digital conditions. Hope that was helpful.
Mark, that was more than helpful. And Peter, thank you for asking that question, because I'm going to take this clip. I'm going to take this clip and put it on the introduction page of the main Scribal Hyperbook so people can look at what exactly is coming up. All right, Mark, thank you. Thank you so much. And we will see you 1 week from today. And folks, again, go ahead and interact with this Hyperbook. You will see the video, this transcript, your own questions, and you can add your own comments and questions there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Laura's been raising her hands here, and other people have as well. Laura, listen to what Srikant just said. We're going to go online, and yes, I will respond to what you say there, I promise.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.